So now let's take a look more in depth on NURBS surfaces. Switch back to the layer where we created our first lofts. And we're going to actually use the Extract Surface tool to make a NURBS surface. So go to your 3D tool set, find Extract, go up to the Mode bar, choose the Surface mode, the fourth one over, and then check your settings. We want to make sure that all of these are unchecked. We want to make sure that Create Planar Objects is not an option, or else we would not get a NURBS surface, we'd get a 2D object. So now you'll see when we hover our mouse over a surface, it highlights in red. The object does not need to be selected, and we can pick any surface on a 3D object that we want. So we want one of these twisty surfaces, so select it. We can of course use the Shift key to select more, but we just want this one. So go ahead and press the check mark. And now we have a NURBS surface. And we can drag that away from the object and see that we have this twisting surface with no real depth to it. Let's take a closer look at NURBS surfaces. NURBS surfaces have many of the same principles as a NURBS curve, but instead of having a single line, we have a grid of vertices. These grids are laid out in what's called a U and a V direction. It's really a lot like an X and a Y, except we're not dealing with planar space, we're dealing with a grid system that is aligned only to this surface. So we call the X direction, the horizontal direction, U, and the vertical direction, V. Each of those vertices has a weight and a degree, just like the curve. We're also dealing with mathematical equations defining the contours of the surface, so it's always very smooth and has a very small amount of data to describe the surface. NURBS surfaces also have a direction. It's called a normal. So in this example, the normal of this curve is facing up. And that comes into account in certain operations like shelling or filleting. You could almost think of it as having an inside and an outside to the surface. NURBS curves also have an edge. Now, that edge is mostly just to show us where it is, so we get that line in Vectorworks that shows the boundary of the curve. When we go into the Reshape mode for a NURBS surface, we get a few different options. First of all, we can select a single point. We can select all of the vertices in the U direction, or all the vertices in the V direction. And like with a NURBS curve, we can constrict our reshape to be in the working plane, in the X direction, in the Y direction of the working plane, or just in the Z direction. So right now we're going to be in the Z direction for a single point. This particular point has a weight of 1, so when we pull that up, you'll see the difference there is pretty subtle. It's just kind of a little bend. And in fact, it's really only when we add some of its neighbors that we start to see the curve of that plane take effect. This point has a weight of 100, so that's going to be a lot more significant of a bend. Just like a NURBS curve, we can make this an interpolated curve. So if we go to Model, 3D Power Pack, Create Interpolated Surface, let's just leave the default number of points and the degree to what we have. So it's the same number of total vertices, 49. So now it's a lot easier to see when we change the vertex what that curve is going to do. It's going to go right through that point. The other thing we can do with a NURBS surface is we can trim around the edges. So I'll just use the regular trim tool and cut across a corner. Let's get rid of this outside corner. The mathematical definition of the curve is the same. We've just taken that edge, that boundary, and we've trimmed it to a different shape. And this will allow us to piece different NURBS surfaces together along that trim line. Over in Object Info, if we want to go back to the original shape, we can say untrim. And that is essentially like getting rid of the crop for that NURBS surface. So now we have a curve with no depth to it, so that's kind of useful if we're modeling something like paint or stretched fabric on a frame, but often we want that to be a solid surface, something that actually feels like a material in the world. One of the tools we have at our disposal is Shell. So go to your 3D toolset and find the Shell Solid tool. Then go up to the mode bar and let's add a thickness. So let's picture this as, say, a sheet of plywood. So let's make it, it's a relatively small object. Let's make it a 1/2 inch thickness. And now we pick the surface that we want to shell, so this twist, and check. And now that's actually converted that into an object with a 1/2 inch thickness. And over in Object Info, we can actually change that thickness. Now we may find that this will actually have a limit. If we make the object too thick, eventually certain twists in the curve are going to intersect with itself. So if I do something unusually large, like 10 feet, it's not going to accept that value. You can almost always go down, but you can't necessarily go past a certain value. Another thing we can do over in Object Info is change whether the shell goes inside or outside the surface. So by just toggling that, we switch the direction. And that's where showing that normal, that arrow that goes and shows the direction of the curve comes in. If we're going inside, it's against the normal. If we're going outside, it's with the normal. And over in the Shell Solid tool, it's actually something we can change here, whether we start inside or outside. So let's look at what else we can do with the Shell tool. Let's go back to our twist here. And if you remember when we lofted this, we made it into a solid. So now it's a generic solid. Let's say we want to make this into a fancy kind of vase with a hole in the middle. If we go to Shell Solid, and let's set the thickness to 1 inch. In our preferences, we want to make sure that we're going to the outside here. So we're adding a 1 inch surface all the way around. Now when we select the solid object, we're actually selecting which faces we want to be open. So if we click on just that top here and click the check mark, now we've set that to be open and every other surface is closed. So now we've made this 3D object here that's around that generic solid and we have that hole in the middle. And similar to when we looked at fillets and chamfers, we can see which surface here was open. We can modify the object and change which surface is open. And we can click Remove to go back to the original solid. Let's look at this group of curves here. So when we lofted this, we created separate surfaces, and we can't make one single NURBS surface out of these. This actually ends up being 4 separate surfaces because we're turning a corner there. And so we have a group of surfaces. So go ahead and go to Modify and Ungroup. So now we have our 4 surfaces again. So we can combine various NURBS surfaces together into a single surface with Model, 3D Power Pack, Stitch and Trim surfaces. This takes those intersecting curves, and anywhere we can form a line between them, combines them together, and here we end up with a generic solid. Sometimes if you actually have 2 NURBS curves that are coplanar, you can get those to stitch together, sort of like a join mode. This still seems like it's a thin object. Even though we have 4 walls, we don't have a lot of depth to it. It kind of seems like an origami shape, right? So let's add a top and bottom to this. We go to Model, 3D Power Pack, create planar caps. Vectorworks will try to find open surfaces and add the shape that fills those in. These are still separate NURBS curves at the moment. We can select all of these surfaces, Model, 3D Power Pack, Stitch and Trim surfaces, and now we have our generic solid that combines all of those together. Let's look at another use for Stitch and Trim surfaces. Select the Rectangle tool, and just draw a rectangle. It's going to be wider than this object. Now we can directly convert this into a NURBS surface. So if you go to Model, 3D Power Pack, create surface from curves, because we can create a NURBS curve from this rectangle, that'll just automatically convert to a rectangular surface. To reshape this a little easier, we're going to make this into an interpolated surface. Go to Model, 3D Power Pack, create interpolated surface. Let's give ourselves 9 points in the U direction, and let's make them 2nd degree. Now when we go to the Reshape tool, let's do all the U vertices together, and we're going to only move them in the Z direction. Now go and just grab every other vertex here, and make a kind of corrugated shape. Just like that. We're going to use this surface to cut this shape. Move that more or less into place. And when we go to a front view, we actually still have all of our selection handles that let us scale the object. Let's just go to a side view and make sure we're passing through the object. Okay, so now that surface is completely intersecting our solid. So let's select them both. Go to Model, 3D Power Pack, Stitch and Trim surfaces. And Vectorworks has used our surface to divide our solid into 2.